Thanks, everyone. So just at a very high level, and then I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Dunn to sort of set the stage here. But we are sorry, getting text messages. We are following up on the important conversation that we had prior to the recess, acknowledging that for many in our community, there was a feeling that we had not done enough to be able to conduct outreach and receive feedback, especially from those communities that will likely be the most impacted by the policy decisions set forth within Thrive. And while we do give a lot of credit and appreciation to the planning board and staff for their ongoing efforts to engage the community, it's not their fault that we began this process in the midst of COVID. And so it's important that we do hear from those voices, and that brought us to this morning, in which we will be receiving an update on the work of our consultants to conduct that expanded outreach. So with that, Ms. Dunn, I'll turn it over to you to sort of set the stage.
All right, good morning, everyone. So correct, we are here to get a briefing from the consultants who've been working all summer on doing the outreach to the targeted communities that you directed them to do. They have provided to the council their report on that work. In addition, that includes a chapter on racial equity and social justice as it pertains to Montgomery County and is relevant to the Thrive Montgomery 2050 plan. And those things are posted on your website, on the council website, under the Thrive webpage. But I'm going to turn it to them. I'd like them to introduce themselves again to you for anyone that hadn't been a part of their introduction that came earlier this summer. And given our brief amount of time, I don't want to take any of it. But when they are finished, we will revisit the schedule just very briefly so that you know what's coming in the weeks ahead. With that, I'll turn it over to our consultant team.
How about I go first? Push the brake line. There we go. I'm Charnel Hicks from CH Planning and Inspire Green. Thank you for inviting us to assist in this effort. I'd like to pass it over here, and then we'll hear from our project manager.
Good morning, Steve Brigham from Public Engagement Associates. Pleased to be here.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Jordan Exanis with Inspire Green CH Planning. Very happy to be back here to talk through the work that we've done over the past several weeks, which we heard a lot of interesting things about the county and the planning process. And so I'm here to kind of summarize what we've heard and talk through the work that we've done to address some of the issues that we heard from the community and how to make the work of planning in the county stronger and more representative of the diverse voices that live here. So just to give an overview again, the goal of our work was really to connect with the Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, what's known as BIPOC communities, as well as low to moderate income residents in the county, and somehow gather some meaningful input on the Thrive 2050 plan recommendations, and then to summarize that feedback in a report and develop a new plan chapter on racial equity and social justice to support the Thrive deliverable. And to do that really required some very focused work. These communities are undeniably very difficult to engage and requires a significant amount of mobilization to get people in the room. And so our first step in approaching this work was to identify where the target populations live, where we needed to do outreach. The map that you're seeing here is this analysis that shows communities that have over 50% of the population that is not Caucasian, and that meets certain income thresholds that demonstrate that they are either low to moderate income or living below the median income level for the county of $111,000. The other thing that was really important to doing this work was to leverage the existing community groups, organizations, et cetera, that are already working in these communities. It would have been virtually impossible to do this work without leveraging those that already have relationships with these folks. And so we worked with over 50 community groups in the county to help really create a personalized approach to talking with people, getting them involved, inviting them to focus groups, hosting meetings in places that people are comfortable with, leveraging folks that do canvassing work, going door to door, talking to people, and doing pop-up events in the areas where these folks live to make them aware of our effort and promote the outreach tools that we were using to gather feedback on the plan and people's perspectives on the issues in the county. So one of the things that we had to do was look at the prior planning effort conducted by the county and the planning department. And while this is a somewhat difficult task because we weren't there, we heard a lot of things from the community, and we kind of summarized, even though there's a lot of great outreach that occurred, some of the main things that we heard about outreach in the past was that there wasn't really strong racial representation amongst those who participated. And even though we do not have hard numbers because no demographic documenting or reporting was done on who was engaged during those first 2 years of outreach, we did manage to, through our questionnaire, which we'll talk about in a minute, kind of poll people who were previously engaged and figure out some demographic information about who they were. And that really yielded to show that the vast majority of folks that said they were involved prior were majority white, majority from West County, majority incomes over 100K, and it's not really representative of the folks that we were seeking to talk to in this process. The other issue that we found is, we spoke with a lot of community groups. There are people who were referenced in the plan as having been engaged. A lot of those people that we spoke to were like, I maybe remember an email, but there was never a meeting. We had a conversation, but it wasn't specifically about Thrive. And so there was a sense that, some of these activities that were documented as having a Thrive meeting with a certain organization were not really as in-depth as were represented. And so there was a little bit of lack of clarity in that regard. So some of the lessons learned, through this process is that, really there's significant, work and resources that's required to engage these communities. A lot of the folks that we talked to, didn't really want to be talked to. They had distrust of us, even though we don't represent the county or any of its processes. They still were a little bit resistant. And so it was really vital that we had compensation for people. We paid people to participate in focus groups. We incentivized our survey. And we offered free food and, other things to try to get people in the door. And this was really essential to make this process work. I think without those incentives, we would have not been able to talk to as many people as we did. And this was especially important given the compressed time frame of trying to organize and launch a comprehensive community engagement effort within just a few weeks' time. So to talk a little bit about the specifics of what we did, our main engagement mechanism was we hosted 8 focus groups, which was with people of color, immigrant groups, working class residents, as well as youth of color. These were 2-hour meetings where we met with people, some in person, some virtually, where we had conversations about the plan, the methodology, the policies and issues, and really gave people a chance to talk about what they felt about the different plan areas and then polled them on whether or not they felt the plan was addressing all of the issues that they saw in their communities and whether or not the prescriptions fit how they felt the direction should be going in the future. And then we ended those conversations with, specific, gave people the opportunity to give their specific anecdotes and stories about, how things were working for them, how they felt they may have faced discrimination in the county, things that they felt needed to happen to make Montgomery County a more, equitable place to live. We also hosted a community forum, which had, a lot of interest. We had over 300 people register and about 160 people attend, representative of folks from, all different walks of life across the county. I'd say about a third of those folks were BIPOC. 2/3 were white and affluent, but interestingly had very similar views to the BIPOC folks that we spoke to. And, a lot of folks represented from Silver Spring, Greater Bethesda area, Gaithersburg, Wheaton, and Rockville, was where the majority of folks hailed from. We also had a community questionnaire. One of the challenges of this process is trying to figure out how to achieve this quote-unquote meaningful input on the Thrive methodology. And so we designed a questionnaire, not a survey, but a questionnaire that kind of dug into a little bit the planning themes. And this was something that we distributed widely. We mailed postcards to our target populations. We promoted this through all the community groups. We promoted at pop-up events, and really leveraged those word of mouth and relationships to get people to take this survey. We had almost 2,000 people take the questionnaire, almost 700 of those folks from our target demographic, and really gave us a good base of information to compare with what we heard from the focus groups in terms of people's attitudes about Thrive, as well as things that we could be doing better to engage them and plan for the future. To help focus this group, we did organize a small advisory group with people from the county that know these communities, that work in these communities, from key organizations like Impact Silver Spring, MORE, and CASA, and they were involved on the front end to help us plan our engagement, to help us design questionnaire questions and making sure that we were on track. And then we met with them again on the back end to kind of review what we were hearing and get their input on how to prepare for the community forum. And the last thing we did, which I've kind of already mentioned, is pop-ups. We hosted 7 pop-up events where we were out in the community handing out materials and talking to folks and soliciting their participation in our survey and to sign up for a community meeting. So what we heard, generally speaking, I think a fair characterization is that people had a lukewarm response to the plan. I found that, through conversations with people, they generally liked a lot of the things that they were hearing, but they felt that the issues, were not necessarily representative of things that they were facing on a daily basis. And I think because of that, a lot of times the prescriptions seemed to miss the mark, or they felt like, the root issue wasn't being addressed before we got to these policies, and they were worried that if the policies were implemented, that they would be harmed in the process. Housing in particular, folks expressed a lot of concerns about what was going to happen to their communities. And on transportation, it was actually really interesting. People generally supported, the transportation issues, but felt that the policies did not really reflect their day-to-day realities. I think one of the most important things to point out through this process is, we all like and support good urbanism, but there's a lot of people that rely on personal vehicle for their livelihood. And for a lot of them, they felt that, the vehicle represented financial independence. And some of these ideas about walking and biking were beyond what was attainable for them in terms of their lifestyle and economic situation. These are folks that work construction, house cleaners, Uber and Lyft drivers, people who mow grass and, require equipment, require vehicle miles to capture as many jobs as possible to make their livelihood. The idea that they were going to take a train or a bus, it just didn't fit with their reality, and they felt that, that reality was not being reflected in the plan, and that some concession needed to be made for, the economic empowerment of their communities, because they really rely on, car for their livelihood. With regards to design, arts, and culture, I think, people, liked what they heard, but also felt that there was a real missed opportunity in terms of leveraging the culture of these diverse communities and really centering them in things like placemaking, public art, so on and so forth, to really, help capture the tremendous cultural force that does exist in this county, and wanted to see those things go a little bit further. And on a positive note, I think everyone really appreciated the work the county was doing on parks and recreation. We had a lot of heated conversations in focus groups. When we got to the park section, that's when everyone kind of relaxed and said, you know what, I like the parks are great, more of the same, please. So that was encouraging to hear, that folks were pleased where we were going in that direction. So I'd like to touch briefly on some of the themes. I know I've spoken to some of these already, but we didn't talk about complete communities yet, which is one of the kind of focal points of Thrive. I think a lot of residents felt that their communities were complete. Some did not. Some were very resistant to the idea because they felt the way the idea was framed was not realistic for them or attainable for their communities. Some of that was related to the transportation issues that I described before, but also too just because they, I think there was some, legacies of lack of opportunity that they felt, it would require a lot to get to the point where they could do everything within their, immediate community, and did not feel like that was realistic. I think, again, the access to affordable housing was a huge concern. I think folks are really feeling the squeeze of housing prices. And also, too, we heard a lot of stories about programs that were intended to help people not working, whether due to personal bias or racism or feelings of discrimination. We heard folks talking about how, they tried to leverage a foreclosure prevention program and they got foreclosed on anyways, and then their caseworker's brother bought their house. We heard stories about how, people, are complaining about code violations in their building and the code enforcement officers being paid off. And they're in court and dealing with that. Just a lot of these kind of stories where folks are, working to try to improve their stake, and they're being dealt with in a predatory way instead of a way where people are genuinely trying to help them. And I think that's something that's important to call out. We'll get to the recommendations later, but I think a lot of what we heard is we need checks and balances to ensure that these programs that are designed to help people are actually having the desired outcome. Another topic we spent a lot of time speaking to was the idea of integration, both racial and economic. The plan really centers this idea as a way of addressing some of the challenges that vulnerable communities face. And, residents, were open to it. I think they wanted diversity, but they were concerned that it was not going to necessarily benefit them, or that they would be displaced and had to move further away or somewhere else. So they were very skeptical of it. And then there was people who felt, well, what about the other communities where the jobs and things already exist? Are we going to integrate those communities as well? I'd like to live in Potomac or in one of these other areas where the good schools already are. And that was a common theme in the conversation. If we're going to do this, we should be doing it across the board, not just diluting the impoverished areas, but making sure that all areas across the county had a similar demographic proportion that was representative of who lives in the county as a whole, so that all communities had wealth and poverty inclusively next to each other, so that people are interacting and really building the social capital that the plan speaks to. And on the issue of compact growth, there was quite a bit of concern, I would say, in the low-income communities about what this meant. I think folks felt that this kind of extended the legacy of segregation that exists in the county, focusing development in these areas. They're very worried about overcrowding, very worried about maintaining their access to open space and green space, and how to balance this idea of developing and adding density, but also increasing the opportunity to access healthy spaces. And they felt that this would not really benefit their community. So and we heard a lot of kind of like chicken and egg type of conversations about how to do this, what's going to work, what's not going to work, what needs to happen first, which I think are important to highlight in the plan. With regard to the questionnaire, we asked a lot of different questions, but I think the main things that we heard are that for the target population, jobs and economic opportunities are really their primary concern. Commute time was a huge issue. We heard folks that are having to traverse great distances to get to jobs, and they want the access to local jobs. Housing, again, was a huge concern, as well as the reliability of transportation. And in terms of parks and public spaces, there was some discussions about safety, and wanting more things in close proximity to their home. So, shifting to the community forum, this was a very different conversation, and it's a bit harder to follow. There's a lot of different folks represented in the room, so the views and opinions vary a great deal, which I think is to be expected. But I think overall, what we learned is that people really also echoed the sentiment that there needed to be a greater urgency in addressing the affordable housing challenges in the county. I think the broader group was also very interested in environmental issues, and also wanted to make sure that there was, equity was emphasized more thoroughly throughout, the planning processes as well as development. And we also got some input from people in the forum about best practices on community engagement. I don't know that we need to go into these all today in detail, but some of the things they mentioned are things that we tried to do, which is really just making sure that engagement is easy for underrepresented people. A lot of these folks are busy, they have multiple jobs, they're working to survive. Attending a meeting is not high on their list of priorities, and we just need to do more to make sure that things are clear, that their voices are being valued, and that we're doing engagement where it's convenient for people. Some of the big themes out of the forum, beyond what we talked about, is that there was some concern that more was needed to be understood about implementation of the plan and how things were going to work. A lot of people said that the plan was difficult to understand, and that more kind of capacity building needed to happen when having community conversations. I can definitely reinforce this point. I think a lot of the focus groups, people felt that it was too dense, too much material to cover in 2 hours, and they're kind of like, if you do this again, can we maybe focus on one issue at a time? And I think it would really be helpful if this was an iterative process where you spoke to people, talked to them through some issues, give them time to reflect, come back, and allow them to reapproach. And I think there's two big views on Thrive itself. Is that some people thought that the process needed to be kind of slowed down and redone. And some people thought that, we should pass Thrive and make adjustments and, keep looking towards the future and maybe look to revise and refine a few years down the road. So I have, I think this is maybe a good place to take a break if folks have questions. I don't know if everyone's been able to review the work that's been done to this point. The next, we'd like to talk about kind of our recommendations based on what we heard, but definitely want to give you all a chance to react to what you heard about our engagement efforts and, fill in any gaps that may exist in your understanding of what we've been up to the past few weeks.
Great, thank you very much for that presentation and that hard work, which I know was a condensed period of time, not optimal, but clearly a lot of ground was made up and a lot of ground was covered. And I'm very impressed with sort of the robust nature through which you tackled this this summer. So I appreciate that. I'm just going to say a couple of general comments speaking for myself, and then I will yield to colleagues. And just so everybody knows who's in the queue, I've got Councilmember Reamer, followed by Councilmember Navarro, and then Councilmember Jawando. Anybody else that would like to speak, just please text me. We're not going to please everybody with this document. That is obvious. But what is also obvious is that we can't do nothing. We have to, I think, reasonably come up with a plan that does consolidate and take into account the myriad of different views and perspectives, that helps better connect the various master plans that we have in our community, that each individually in their own right are doing great work in terms of community engagement, but thinking more broadly, I think, is something that most reasonable people could agree is something we need to do. And I'm not sure exactly what the answer will be, but this obviously provides us with more key and important data points that are going to help us as we go through this process. And the process itself, I think there are some lessons learned moving forward that we can apply. But some of the comments that you all shared just really resonated with me in some of the individual conversations I've had with a number of residents who are not as engaged, who are not emailing regularly, who are not participating in all of the sessions that we have had thus far. And so that balance is critical. And the issue of transportation and cars is real. And that's self-independence. And so there are aspirational goals that we all need to strive and work towards achieving. But if you're working 2 or 3 jobs and you have to, even the most complex transportation systems in the world are going to struggle to meet the unique needs of every individual that's out there. So this document is obviously important for so many different reasons, and critically important that we do our best to get this right, and that's what we are trying to do. So I really appreciate all of your efforts thus far. So just some general comments from me. So I am now going to go to Councilmember Reamer, again, followed by Councilmember Navarro, and then Councilmember Jawando.
Thank you. Thanks for your work on this. I heard loud and clear and a recurring theme that we need to do more, we need to do it better. And I think you have, with such a focused effort, you have really developed and innovated and demonstrated a lot of the techniques that we need to really grapple with and improve and use in a more fulsome way in the future. And so I appreciate the work, and I thought you've given us a very balanced review of what you've received, and you've drafted a report chapter for us. We now have that for our consideration and Thrive, and that's going to be enormously useful. And I appreciate all of the work that went into that. And the themes that you've highlighted are enduring. And I can think back to the very first master plans that I worked on as a council member, and we were just discussing, those basic challenges of who's at the table and how do you ensure that the full community is at the table and that the views that you're considering are representative to the community. And so you have developed some tactics that I think are really intriguing, polling, focus groups, things like that. So I wanted to ask what you felt was most effective. What do you think were some of the engagement tactics that we should really take some time to reflect on and think more about? And if you could talk a little bit about, in your report to us, you described the difference between metrics on engagement versus outreach. Could you just expand on that a little bit more so that we can think, have that present here as we're considering how to take the lessons learned going forward as well?
Sure. So yeah, I think, big picture, when we talk about engaging quote-unquote hard-to-reach communities, the work of mobilizing, it's probably 3-4-fold the effort of actually engaging, right? And I think that's the part which, for those of us that went to planning school, we had to suffer and endure through, door knocking and phone banking and doing that hard work, to really make personal connections with people, to build relationships, and, generate some level of trust so that people will show up to conversations authentically as themselves. That requires a lot of different things, right? It requires cultural competence. It requires a certain level of respect and deference to those folks. I think for poor communities in particular, you need to incentivize people's participation. You need to pay them for their time. And I think, ultimately it really just requires a transparent and honest process. I think people want to participate, but a lot of times they get what we call planning fatigue, right? They've been told over and over things are going to happen, and they don't see it, so they're like, well, why am I going to go to that? It's just the same song and dance. So I think, accountability on the side of, the people who are responsible for implementing things is very important. That being said, I think, planning at its best, it leverages the existing actors. One of the things that, I wrote to in the plan chapter is that, it's never going to be possible to know and talk to everyone, right? So, you have to kind of build those relationships with the people who do have their feet on the ground, who are doing the grassroots work, who are talking to people who already have the established trust, and bring them into your process, empower them to do a lot of that work with you. One of my favorite planning diagrams is the ladder of citizen participation. It talks about, the different rungs of participation where, generally we see, kind of lip service, right? Or therapy. In the worst cases, manipulation. Like, we're doing this and we're gonna, throw a bunch of information at you, and you might have some ability to have input, you might not. But I think what really needs to happen is some level of delegation of power to communities to have more influence over what happens in their communities. And I think we've said that in these conversations, and people kind of raise their eyebrow. Well, that's already a problem here because da da da. Well, it has to be centered on the right communities, right? If it's the same players who've had power for generations making decisions, influencing these processes, you're not going to get different outcomes. But understanding who are the communities that don't currently have any power, who are the communities that are hurt, in what ways have they been hurt, how do we undo that, how do we center their issues? Because at its core, this equity work, it's really seeking to heal what has happened in the past, right? The distrust that exists, it didn't happen overnight. The poverty, all these things, they were created. And in order to fix them, more attention is going to have to be paid in those places. And I think, having that approach, will actually motivate people to be involved. And then once momentum is built, I think you won't have problem mobilizing people. They'll mobilize themselves once they realize that the process is authentic. I've seen this in a lot of my work. We go in, we have a meeting, and people are kind of like, who are you? And then we talk through the issues, and we center their voice in the process, and then people will contact me afterwards and say, oh, thank you for leading an authentic process. I went back to my constituents and we assembled a whole host of comments and we're submitting it to you because we actually think this is a real process, right? They went and did the work on their own and sent content because they felt that we were respectful of them in the process, that we cared about what they wanted to say, we cared about what their issues were. And it really, in my mind, stems from, more so not what you do, but how you do it. And I know it's a big cliche, but I think leading with respect, it's really the core piece of this, because a lot of these communities, that's a primary value that they hold, right? If you come and talk at me like I don't know like I'm stupid, it just, the fog goes up and they're just like, they're out of there, you know? But if you come and say, hey, I'm a planner, you know, we want to learn about your community, please tell us what you know so that we can do a better job because your perspectives are more important than mine, then people are, oh, okay, that's kind of interesting. I haven't heard that before, right? And I think that's really central for this kind of work, is to help people understand the community's opinion is more important than the practitioners, because they're the ones that ultimately have to live there, that ultimately have to continue to do the work of making that place work day in and day out. And it's something that you have to nurture and build over time.
Thank you.
Thank
I was
you.
wondering if I could just quickly add to
Yes.
that. I echo everything Jordan said. I think it's really important to reach out to community groups that have legitimacy in different communities and work with them closely. So 2 concrete examples. We work with CASA right from the get-go. They helped organize a focus group in Wheaton with only Spanish-speaking residents. We did the same thing with Cheer in Long Branch. In a previous project I did with the school system, we reached out to Impact Silver Spring and did several focus groups with different, with Ethiopian immigrants and with Asian immigrants. So, the same thing is really important with African-American communities and low-income communities. Who are the legitimate community groups in each of those places that can help do the outreach and help you host meetings, co-host meetings, maybe even lead meetings that can make a real difference. And what kind of, the stipends really matter. That really matters to people. It says you understand my situation and you're honoring that. But in other projects, we provide childcare, we provide meals, we provide transportation stipends to help them get there if that's an issue. So it's going the extra mile to understand what their circumstance is and what will enable them to participate and what keeps them from participating in normal processes. I think the last thing I would say, this was something that was echoed several times near the end of the community forum, which is compressed timeframes are the enemy of equity and justice. And I think a lot of people in this process in July and August felt like, oh, they're coming to us at the end of the process and it's really hurried and they got to get our voices and a report gets in and then it's going to be approved. And it's like, well, why now and why is it so hurried now, right? So I think that's really important for the future. How do we engage in the beginning, throughout, the middle, the end, so that they really feel like their voices are heard throughout?
Thank you for that. Just in the queue, colleagues, I've got Councilmember Navarro, followed by Councilmember Jawando, then Councilmember Rice, then Councilmember Katz, then Councilmember Friedson. Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, thank you so much for this report. It's interesting, you just said that, the compressed time is enemy of equity, and here we are only dedicating an hour to such an important report. So I am hoping that colleagues entertain the idea of having a follow-up discussion, because, as I'm listening here, and I'm literally, I think, a couple of months away from finishing my service on the county council, and we are here 3 months. And we're here because of the Racial Equity and Social Justice Act that I led and my colleagues engaged in, and everyone in the county decided to really invest time, including the planning department, to adopt such an extraordinarily important piece of legislation, because then it sort of forces us to have these conversations, right? It's not a one-off. It's not a, check the box. I've been saying a lot, and people that have invited me to talk about this, that, now the next term and going forward is when the rubber meets the road. I mean, this is when the implementation really is going to now be needed, and it will not be easy. And I think this presentation to me very much, illustrates that. Because a lot of the things that I see written here are things that have been done, right? I mean, the Latino Civic Project that I decided to launch from my office because I was representing the epicenter of the Latino community precisely has implemented all of those best practices. And so there are a number of things, and I was just interested in what you had to say, because again, I don't think this just applies to planning. As a matter of fact, we've just gone through this primary process, and I was thinking, this applies to everything, right?
Yeah.
Political engagement and participation, every single policy area you can think of, this is the blueprint. The question is, are folks interested in doing it or not? Because it does start with respect, and it starts with really, truly wanting to engage folks, right? Because there is this panacea to somehow hard-to-reach communities, which I also always laugh, because I always say, I remember this one particular immigration attorney way back when I wasn't even in public office on the Spanish language TV stations, and he would say, yo hablo tu idioma. Well, guess what? Dude had expanded all of his franchise because he understood how to get to his market. So it's not like they're hard to reach. It's whether we want to reach them.
Right.
And so this notion of building the civic awareness, civic education, civic participation, that is patient work, and it does take a little while. But I gotta tell you, when that light bulb goes off, right, in these so-called hard-to-reach communities, and they're like, wait, you mean to tell me that I can influence where that building goes or where that road goes? Oh, I have a lot to say. Okay?
Yeah.
So it's not like they don't have anything to say. It's not that, oh my God, they're just not interested in education of their children.
Right.
The systems have been pretty much designed so that they're not really interested. I felt that when I was a PTA mom, when my 30-year-old was entering kindergarten. I stopped going to PTA meetings because I could not understand what in the world they were doing. And I went to school here, graduated college here, was bilingual, bicultural, everything. So I just hope, and this is more for my colleagues that are come back, this is a really good blueprint for the entire policy work of this council in this county. Because I think it is all contained in one report. Again, it's not like we haven't done it before, because we have. We know the best practices. So, I mean, just curious then, from your perspective, in terms of the overarching, and by the way, just another parentheses, and this will probably get me in trouble, I'm gonna say it anyway. I think that we also have to be careful sometimes with some of the community organizations who also do have a particular policy agenda.
Yes.
Because then how do you know, from a practitioner perspective, are you getting objective input, right? Like I'm really big in just building the leadership strength of people in the community, right? Kind of taking out the middle man person type of thing. And it's very necessary for a lot of reasons. Those community organizations are really important. But I think at some point, folks have been here long enough that if you just give them the tools, they can advocate for themselves, right? So I'm just interested in that perspective, in terms of what you, and I know it was a very short period of time, planning, every policy decision, everything. You talk about a plan that has to be developed. Do you believe that we have the assets necessary, right? The human capital necessary, et cetera, to be able to do that effectively? And if we do forward, with this plan, which is an important plan, I'm very curious to hear what was the feedback surrounding, what are the things that should be then modified, going forward?
Sure. So the first piece, I think it's a great observation, because in theory, we wouldn't need a go-between, right? You should be able to, interact directly with people. And you're right, in a short time frame, it's really hard to know who's who. I think for me personally, there was elements of this, like being a quote-unquote outsider, which was good for me, because I was like, hey, I don't know what I don't know, so I don't know whose toes I'm stepping on, it doesn't matter, right? But, there were some challenges, right, where we invited people into the process, and then I realized kind of halfway through, I'm like, oh, this person doesn't like poor people.
Right.
And that was like, it was like, now my spider sense is tingling, I have to take everything that this person says with a grain of salt. Luckily, I have the insight to see that. Not everybody, recognizes those things. I think, It's really about humility, like, and understanding, like, some of the things I said before, right? Like, you know, centering the people and understanding that, you know, everyone has an agenda, like, in terms of organizations, elected officials, so on and so forth. You know, the plan is really about getting all the ideas and issues on paper and, you know, trying to build some consensus. And like was said earlier, you're never going to, like, please everyone, but you have to have an honest dialogue about what all the issues are. Because without that, then you're only planning for, you know, 2/3 of what the issues are. And you're going to miss things. We all have blind spots. I've been doing this a long time. I talk to communities and they say things to me and I'm like, oh my, I can't believe I missed that, right? I thought I was thinking about those groups, but, you know, they have experiences that I don't have, right? Whether they're handicapped or what have you. You know, they're like, you know, my biggest problem is I have to take my wheelchair in the street because the sidewalk's too narrow. I don't think about that on a day-to-day basis, right? So these are things that require those conversations to have, even for practitioners who have been doing this a long time. You know, and as far as capacity, I once upon a time worked for park and planning. They got a lot of people, right? I think it's about having the directive and the staff to say, we're going to commit this amount of people to do this work of, you know, relationship building. You know, once upon a time when I worked in community planning, I was told, I was discouraged from talking to people. This was not here, but in Prince George's County, it was like, you know, why are you talking to these people? And I'm like, well, aren't I supposed to be making relationships with the community? Isn't this what we're supposed to be doing, building trust? And they were like, you know, you need to slow down with the community meetings. And I'm like, okay, well, you know, I think that's the, you know, the thing that I've seen a lot is that, you know, these people are not always easy to engage, right? You have a meeting, they come in, they're disruptive. Well, who asked for this? I don't want that. Well, I did that. And they start cursing at, like, you know, all sorts of stuff. We've had police called in public meetings. Like, for me, I kind of like that stuff because I'm like, hey, like, we're getting to the real issues and you can talk through it. For a lot of people, that's just like, I don't want to deal with that. We're going to just do this kind of like really quick and dirty engagement so that we can avoid the problems that we know are coming. But, you know, for me, I feel like you have to face the storm, right?
Well, you do, and I guess I'll close with this. I appreciate you saying that too, because even when I was a member of the Board of Education, and I remember sometimes wondering, like, do we, you know, when we say we want parental engagement, or when we say we want community engagement, do we really? Because the question is not that the public in these communities don't have anything to say. They have a lot to say.
Yeah.
But then when they say it, then we have to respond to that.
Right.
So, you know, at some point you have to also face the reality that, do you really? You know, so let's not put the onus on folks not wanting to participate or not whatever. They also understand that, hey, yeah, maybe I've done that and nothing happened, because at the end of the day, you know, what a pain to have to now address all of these other issues, right? So there is, I mean, there are all these dynamics. And so what I will say is that, you know, back in that time, 2004 or whatever, I was tracking the growth of the communities of color in the county. Now, this is a county that is majority people of color. This is a school system that's like 73%, you know, students of color. Montgomery College is 78%, you know, students of color. There is no way that this county can thrive unless these communities are absolutely present and their voices are included. If not, we're setting ourselves up. And so to me, this is why this exercise was so important. And it also has lots of layers about, you know, who are the staff in these institutions and these agencies? Are they empowered? Are the staff empowered to do the work? And again, it's not because it's something, you know, trendy that we should do. It's because for a jurisdiction like ours, again, we're not going to succeed unless we do this. So I applaud all of you. I do think that Thrive is very important. I think it has a lot of elements that are so critical for the future of this county. And I hope that, you know, that we can, I hope folks will feel like their time was worth it in this participation. And then moving forward, we start way in advance, not just with planning, but with all of these other policy areas as well. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I'll just note to Councilman Navarro's point, if we don't get through, and we may not, because this is a very important and robust discussion, then we will look at, and as soon as possible, having a second part to this discussion. Next is Councilmember Jawando.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for very thoughtful discussion. I'm really happy I got to go in the order I did after Councilman Navarro. So just amen everything she just said. I also agree with your comments, Council President Albernaz, and want to thank the Inspire folks for your hard work here. When you said something that I was going to say anyway, but I'm definitely going to say it now because you basically quoted it. You said the message is authentic, right? And the messengers have to be authentic. I often interpret life through movies, and one of my favorite movies of all time is Crimson Tide with Denzel Washington and Gene Hackman. And if you know the plot of that movie, it's about a nuclear missile ship, and before there's a launch, there has to be authentication of the message that's coming from the Pentagon. And they go through this process on the boat. If you remember the scene, they run to these keys and they open the safe and there's a authenticator. And they go over and everyone has to read it. It has to be a repeated message. It's a series of letters. And at the end, after everyone reads the same series of letters, Denzel Washington, the lieutenant commander, says to the captain, the message is authentic. And they say, I concur, so the message is authentic. I think that these practices and policies and strategies that you've described in this chapter and what you've done in a very truncated period, the outreach, the engagement, childcare, the authentic messaging, those were those authenticators. Those were the letters on those cards. And I say that because I think we have to, and Councilman Navarro said this point very plainly, we've done these things in different contexts. The Latino Education Project, I started a nonprofit called Our Voices Matter that worked in low-income communities. We've had versions and parts of this, but I feel like the process has not been institutionalized in such a way that we are doing it every time and building upon the important work that's already been done, the strategies, the proven work, and leveraging it completely. And I think that if I take anything from this, and I tried to manufacture as part of the Fed committee some additional outreach and engagement on my own, and we worked with the council, and then council president put a process in, again, trying to get more people engaged. We have to systematize and authentic, deep, meaningful engagement and not have to recreate it every time. And it's going to change. The people will change. It's just like youth engagement. The kids graduate. You gotta go back and get different kids to be a part of it. But I think that is something that we need to invest in everything we do. Couldn't agree with that point that was made more. And so even to Councilmember Reamer's point about the strategies that yielded the most benefits, this is not rocket science, right? People are living their lives. You need to relieve the pressure, engage with them authentically, pay them transportation. Don't try to, talk above them. Don't try to use jargon. Really take the time to get deep, meaningful input, and do it every time. And I think, and it takes, and I think we're going to have a real conversation about what that looks like, because it will take time and it will slow things down and it will be difficult. But once you get it going, I think you'll gain some of that. You can move with greater pace. But so I would love to, I'd love your comment now, but is there any place that has done this well? Because I don't think it's just our challenge. I know it's not just our challenge. And this is not to say that we haven't tried to do this in different ways, both as a council and as a county government. But are there places that have institutionalized and systematized this type of deep, thoughtful engagement in a way that we can model as part of our our ongoing commitment to racial equity and social justice? And so that's question one. And two, if not, we're going to need to work with you or with others to develop that over time. And I think that is going to be a really important item for the continuing council and the new council to do, to make sure that we have participatory democracy. So would love your comments on that, but also just thank you. Thank you for what you did and for putting words and emphasis around something I think many of us were feeling.
So I'll start by talking about, is this something that's happened before, something that we've seen, something that we've done? And the answer is yes. The challenge is that it's hard, right? So you do it, you get everybody out, and then you hear, well, we're not here to talk about that pothole in front of your house, right? We're not here to talk about the flooding in your basement, because this project that we're talking about isn't going to cause the flooding in your basement to get any worse. Yes, you got plucked off your car last spring. That's a separate issue. So what happens is folks are like, yeah, well, that was interesting, but
Right.
So I think that it's a matter of being comfortable, meeting people where they are, and being just putting what you came here to discuss aside from time to time, and focusing on what matters to the people who are in the room, or at least having some way to accommodate that. We need to have more people show up, folks from the fire department, folks from streets at every meeting, sadly.
Right, they can get that solved in addition to you getting your feedback. It's
Right.
a two-way.
Right, exactly. So I'll pass to Jordan.
Thank you. I'm glad Charnel went first because it's a tough question to answer. I think there's a lot of best practices out there, and we can certainly delve into that work. Some of it was referenced in doing ours. But I actually want to speak to something slightly different, which is I think it starts with capacity building in the communities that you're serving. One of my mentors, did real community organizing, kind of radical planning work in East St. Louis, a really rough area. And, he was, working at University of Illinois, and he was taking students, and they're, cleaning up these neighborhoods and, getting the city government to pick up trash, and they're doing all this great work to improve the conditions for people in these neighborhoods. And, he'd been doing it a couple years, and, he was feeling good about himself, and he talked to one of the gatekeepers, old black lady who was one of the leaders in the community. And he said, hey, how are we doing? Are we doing a good job? Like, you happy with the work that we've done here? And she was just told him, she was like, you and your students have done wonderful work, but, we're not even a flea on the tail that wags the dog. So if you and all your white students decide to pick up and leave tomorrow, we're going to be right back where we was a year from now. And from that point, that's when they started their planning education in the community to teach people what planning is, how it works, how to do it themselves. I think one of the things that really bothers me about this field is I tell people what I do and no one knows what it is. All these hearings are held relative to their public meetings, but in my opinion, they're behind closed doors. No one understands it, and that's part of the reason why power has been preserved the way that it has, right? We need to open this field up to the communities that we're, trying to help, and like finding that next high school kid who can be a planner in 5 years for the county that understands the intricacies of his neighborhood in a way that I never would hope to, right? That's the kind of work that needs to happen through this process. And I think that's the huge opportunity here, is really working to develop capacity of residents to take on this work on their own. So it's not the burden of the government to figure it all out and do it in this top-down way. Planning by its nature is meant to be a groundswell.
Right.
It's a bottom-up process, and it actually, if it's done the right way, it makes it easier for everybody, right? Because the people want to do the work to transform their communities in a positive way. We all kind of fundamentally want the same things, right? We want to have, decent quality of life. We want to have our kids go to school, get a good education, and we don't want to bother nobody. Like we all want the same thing, right? So how do we support that in a planning sense? It really starts with demystifying this process. I talked about this in this process. It's like, okay, something like coming to council to testify on a plan as a person of color, I don't want to go into a government building and testify. Like that's not something that, you know what I mean? Like people need to be able to do this in an environment where they're comfortable, where they feel like they share their voices. It's safe to do so. And I think that's really something that, you know, from the top level needs to begin to be implemented into policies across the board. It's like, how do we get more young people, you know, more people of color, more of these, you know, quote unquote unheard voices engaged in these processes and building their capacity so that they can have more meaningful engagement. Because what I see throughout this is it's difficult, right? Like we learn these things as good as planners, right? Like bike lanes are good. A lot of people, when you go in their community and talk to them about it, they're like, that's not for us. If you build that bike lane and we're gonna get kicked out, I don't want that. And so it's like they don't want the things that's going to make their community better because they see it as a harbinger for gentrification. But if they could do it themselves, if they could understand and figure out, okay, we're going to do the bike lane, but we're also going to educate everybody about the changes that are coming, make sure they don't like cave to real estate speculation and sell their house and do all, you know, all these wraparound things to stabilize the neighborhoods, then you can actually have things that improve property value and people can stay in place, right? Like, the disinvestment, disinformation, gentrification cycle is well documented, and it has to be deliberately broken to actually make sure that the people that we're hoping to help actually receive the benefit from the changes that are coming.
Important, so
I
important.
just wanted to say one thing quickly. So a previous organization I worked for, America Speaks, did a lot of work with Mayor Tony Williams in DC for 8 years. And he built it was called Office of Neighborhood Action, Office of Neighborhood Planning, Office of Neighborhood Services. And so there were 3 different parts of the government, but they had to work collaboratively on all the different parts of the city. And it took a long time to kind of stand up. They did a lot of great work, and people became a lot more engaged. And then, you know, what happens in political life is the next mayor comes along,
Right.
and those
Right.
offices no longer exist. So, but I think a point that was made before is like, how do you institutionalize this? And how do you institutionalize it where it's not, it doesn't become kind of the next checkbox, oh, we now have to do this, this, and this. I see it as a kind of a strategic framework where it's like, what are the different tools and tactics and strategies we need for the particular situation? But it needs to be done, you know, across the board in local government.
I couldn't agree more, and I'll pass on because I know we've got to move on. But I think that is the work, and I'm certainly committed to it. We have to institutionalize it, and I think so much of the frustration that the community has, and many of us have had, is that, you know, we're working against a system that was set up not to do that, right? And that's the whole tension. And so we're trying to break that down. I commend everyone involved, planning, Inspire, my colleagues, for wanting to do that work. It's going to continue to be important, and I think we've got a good start. And I commit, you know, going forward through the implementation of Thrive and every other planning process and every other legislative process that we can continue to improve that work. You know, we're testifying now virtually. I am. We've had many people do that. We've done field hearings. I think there's other things we can do to systematize and institutionalize this work. So I appreciate that last point. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I'll just make a quick comment here. So, so much of this resonates on every conceivable level, and we have these conversations, but often in isolation and within the context of a budget line item or a project or a policy we're debating. Councilor Navarro's been, as all of my colleagues have been beating this drum on this in previous councils. And I think as a follow-up session, having a deeper dive more holistically across the board and how we communicate and factoring that into processes moving forward is where we need to go. And this body has made great strides. I'm proud of what we've accomplished, but there's always more work that needs to be done. So in a follow-up conversation, I think it would be worth having that broader contextual conversation and engaging other sister county agencies in that conversation, which I think is really important. So I'm going to be the bad cop here. So we've got 15 minutes left in a really important presentation that we are going to provide. I've got Councilmember Rice, Councilmember Katz, and Councilmember Friedson who are slated to speak. If we are not finished by 11:30, We will certainly make sure that we follow up with a second conversation, but I would, again, suggest that we have it within a broader context. But Councilmember Rice.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And Councilmember Navarro has pretty much echoed all of the concerns I have. I'll just say this, that it embodies a simple statement. That is, we say what we want folks to hear when it comes to community engagement, but we don't want to hear what folks have to say. And it is something that is interesting for us because we sometimes go through the motions, right? And I think oftentimes we do that, but we already have predisposed as to what the outcomes are going to be and what folks are going to say. And even though they may say something different, we're like, okay, but you're the one off. And I still automatically know what your community is going to say, and therefore I'm moving forward with this, right? And so I think that for us, it is going to be that intentionality that we need to lead with, to say that we are open to hearing things that we don't want to hear, right? We have to be accepting of that and understanding that it is more than just us saying that we are great, we are terrific, we are doing the right things and doing right by folks, and understand that some of the things we do are not okay. I sit here as a black man who's grown up here in Montgomery County, and I know not all of the decisions, and I need to be reminded from folks in the community. When I look at Vernon Ricks and his wife, and I think to myself about how they've chimed in and said, Craig, listen, I know you think you know what you're doing, but let me tell you what is actually happening in the community. Those kinds of things are incredibly important. And I think that for us as electeds, and for us as an embodiment of government, we have to make sure that we're ready and open to receive that. And then take a step back and pause and say, you know what? Let me rethink this, right? And that's hard. That is not easy. Just as you said, that is not easy. That is hard work to do because we've been doing this a long time. We've been involved, engaged, and I'm talking about a person who's in the community. But I know one thing, I am not the voice of the black community. There are plenty of people who think and have experienced and view things differently from I do. And so I am not the sole lone voice in terms of what goes on in my community, nor am I the one with the panacea for my community as well, right? It takes all of us coming together to create that kind of understanding. And I think, Jordan, one of the things that you said when you said, look, we've got some of the people that are here, and this is what they're saying, and we've got some of the people that are here and what they're saying. And that's from folks that you reached out to. And that's what we experience. And that is the reality. That tells me that we're in the right place, right? Because that truly is what I see. You know, Councilmember Jawando and I have worked on some really tough issues together, along with the council when it comes to especially things impacting our BIPOC communities. And so it really is one where trying to achieve that balance and find it is incredibly difficult and incredibly hard. But I do think that we're now on the right path. I will just close by saying this because I know we're tight for time. When we go to communities, it is not just about going to a festival or an event and putting a table up. And I'm not criticizing because those things happen and those things are important. And those are seen as like the easy ways. Well, I'm going to be at the back to school fair and I've got it set up. But guess what? The majority of folks who go to the back to school fair, guess what they're going for? To make sure that they have school supplies that they can't afford. And so they're hitting every single table to get all that stuff to make sure that they can get that for their children. I'm not trying to talk to you about Thrive. And oh, by the way, let me use this as an opportunity because I work 2 jobs and I don't have a chance to actually play with my kids a lot. So I'm gonna take them to the bouncy house and I'm gonna get them the Slurpee, you know, because those are the things that we normally don't get to do. And so that's where my focus is. So at the festival or at the back to school fair, my focus isn't on Thrive. And yeah, I may talk to you and say, and nod my head and sign the sheet saying that I talked to you, but am I really paying attention? Because I just want that free thing that you have so I can put that in my bag and keep it moving. Yeah. And so that's the thing that we have to understand. We've got to go to these neighborhoods and have engaging conversations with them on their time, right? On their time that is convenient for them, not as a time that's slated for something else, right? I'm going to the grocery store, right? And you standing outside the grocery store, I want to talk to you about Thrive. Listen, seriously, I only have 15 minutes. I got to get back because I got to get to my next shift and I don't have time to talk to you about this right now. Okay, cool. Can you just sign this and take this pamphlet? Right? Those are the kinds of things that, again, and we check a box and say, okay, we did our job, but we really haven't. That's not engagement. Engagement is sitting in somebody's house, right? And talking to them and saying, tell me about what it is that you want to see in your community, like you said, Jordan. Don't lead with thrive. Lead with what it is that you want to thrive.
Right.
That's what it's about. So I think that, again, as we press the reset button, I think we can get there and get to that place. I don't think it's going to take a long time for us because we know we've already done it plenty of times in other situations. We can do it in this one too. I'm just sorry, brother, that you came in at this point and not earlier, because then we would have had it done and we'd be ready to go. So, it is what it is, and we're going to still move forward. So I appreciate you. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Councilmember Katz, followed by Councilmember Friedson.
Thank you very much. That's a tough act to follow. I'll come on Sunday and hear you too. I was very impressive. First off, thank you all for being here and for doing this and for working with us. And this is a topic like many other topics that people, especially in Montgomery County, have an opinion. I know that's hard to believe, but they have an opinion, and there are, in many cases, will come out faster if they disagree with you than if they agree with you. There are those who are, the true advocates who will come out. And one of the things that we have to prove, and all the speakers before me have touched on this, is that we have to prove to people, show people, demonstrate to them that we really do listen to them and that we want to do what they would like us to do. This is for all of our benefits, not just one. George, you were talking about the comfort level. Somebody didn't want to come and sit here and talk to us. I've always joked, I was the mayor of Gaithersburg for many years. I always joked that I could get as much done in the bean aisle, a giant, as I could at any meeting. I mean, somebody would see it, they'd say, Sidney, it's a good thing I bumped into you. There's a pothole in front of me. Now, that pothole, they didn't want to call me, but they would tell me there because they were comfortable, they knew me, and I think that's what we need to do more of. We need to, and I know we're short on time, and I'll try to be as quick on this one as I can, but this whole idea of engaging people who are in the community, who will speak out and show us what we've done correctly and what we haven't. And I'm going to give the example of Emory Grove's Pastor Tim Warner. I don't know if you've met Pastor Warner, but you should. And the Emory Grove years ago was really, it was a traditionally African-American community, and there was home ownership there. And the county government 40, 50 years ago, whatever, decided urban renewal was going to come through and change this. And they had a good heart with it. And they did an absolutely horrible job. I'm from that area. I saw it. The families that were displaced. And they said, oh, you can come back right after we build this beautiful. And they didn't come back. And now Reverend Warner has gotten, with his church, Emory Grove United Methodist Church, Reverend Warner has gotten people together that they're going to build. They've torn down what was there again and started over and have the right formula for this. But what we need to do is more of that. We need to say to somebody, tell us what you want. We will let us work with you. We're going to have to figure out how to do it. We're going to have to figure out how to fund it. We're going to have to figure, there's a lot of figuring out that has to be done, but we need to do it with people who are in the community, who are going to stay in the community, and who will face people every day. And that's what it's going to take. And so the only other question I'm going to have, and I know we're almost finished here, but the only other question I have is when you looked at the various population areas how large did the population area have to be before you said that was an area that was you needed to discuss things with? You know what I'm trying to ask?
Yeah. So the calculation is based off of like the census data. So it looks at the local population and it identifies the tracts where certain metrics are met. So I think probably what happened is that we actually captured more people than fit exactly that target demographic, but we cast a wide enough net to make sure the communities that had significant proportions of low income, people of color, they were targeted. And that target demographic is where we did, our postcard mailings and, some limited, canvassing and pop-ups and things of that nature, where we know just from, knowing the community, this is where, folks live, right? So, yeah, that's kind of the best way I can speak to
And the
that.
only other thing, and I'm going to stop, but the only other thing I did want to point out is that Thrive 2050 is not involved directly in the municipalities that have their own zoning and planning authority, Gaithersburg and Rockville, which is my district. And there are people, though it certainly is going to affect them, whether I live in Gaithersburg, but it's going to, I'm outside, it's certainly going to affect us. But there is confusion on that someone, and of course, you have people with a Rockville mailing address that don't live in the city of Rockville, so then it gets that much more confusing. But people do need to understand that the municipalities themselves are not covered under this legislation or potential legislation. And with that, I'll turn back to you. Thank you all
Councilmember
very,
Katz,
very much.
I'm wondering if I could just, one of the things that you said about the urban renewal
Yeah.
that happened, we heard about that several times in the focus groups. We had in two different focus groups, we had members there who, their families had been disrupted, they lost their homes, they lost their property. And at the end of every focus group, we talked about the issues around integration and, institutional reparations. I really think it's important that the council, the planning commission really think about how do we really counteract kind of the legacy of the racist past. That's something every community is struggling with. But what does it really mean to undo that, right? How do you go about doing that? But that was a fundamental question that came out of most of the focus groups.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add, I think it's really important the distinction you made about the intention, right? Like the intention was good. In planning school, we learn about all this stuff. Like they had good intentions when they built the projects. They had good intentions when they did urban renewal. A lot of these things that we do that are designed to address these issues, they're experiments, right? And the problem a lot of times is the follow through. The devil's in the details. And I think good intentions is not enough to get the outcomes that you want. And the more I got into this, the more people I talked to, the more I read and reviewed the plan, I had to ask myself that question: is this urban renewal 2.0? Like, is this going to, in fact, do the displacement that everyone's afraid of and create this balloon effect? I mean, where you just squeeze people and they end up going even further out. And I think we're not going to have time to get into recommendations today and the plan chapter itself, but I think one of the biggest challenges with this kind of work is like we all want the place to thrive economically. You want new jobs, you want these things, but where those people live that do those low earning jobs, we talk about sustainability, but if everyone that works in your retail establishment, your coffee shop, et cetera, is doing a 2-3 hour commute in because they can't afford to live close by, it really doesn't matter if the people that live close by are driving Priuses, right? And I think that reality needs to really be reflected in this work because it's almost as if the plight of those people in a lot of these planning documents is invisible, right? Like, yeah, we're gonna all be good urbanists and take the train, but the guy who cuts my grass lives an hour away, like it doesn't add up, right? And so we have to think about that as we plan to say, maybe the idea of housing for the local workforce needs to be the priority. Like everyone that works in this area should be able to live in this area. That should be a mathematical possibility.
I mean, you very rarely see anybody carrying a 2x4 on a train. I mean, that's the reality here. And as much as we all should be using the train as much as we can. So anyhow, thank you again, Mr. President.
No problem. Thank you. So Councilman Friedson's going to close this out here and make a comment and maybe ask a question in 4 minutes or less. But there will be a part 2. We are going to work on that as soon as possible and bring you all back. I know there's a lot going on here, but we need to continue this conversation. It's really important. Councilmember Friedson.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you. I mean, this is a really important conversation. I'm glad we're having it. I'm glad that you have done the additional work, and I'm glad, as we had talked about before, and I had specifically talked about both in our public conversation and some of the subsequent one-off private conversations, that we really need a roadmap here, and we need processes, and engagement isn't something that has a beginning and an end. It's an ongoing, evolving process, and so I do think it's important that as we have this discussion and these conversations that you had and the recommendations that you're bringing forward, that we also talk about this not just as the document that's before us now, but as the way in which we do the work that we do, as Councilmember Navarro has talked about, as Councilmember Rice has talked about, as every colleague has really reflected. I don't have a movie to reference, so I'll reference Aristotle. Aristotle said that we are what we repeatedly do. That's culture. Culture isn't what we say, it's what we repeatedly do. And this is a conversation about not just what we do, but how we do it, is another way of saying exactly what he had said, and Jordan, you had mentioned that earlier. And I do think, what we are talking about here is a total paradigm shift for the way in which we do planning and the way in which we do government. And that is an ongoing, evolving process that we are not going to be able to resolve on one individual topic. We're not going to be able to resolve in one individual aspect. That's why the work that has been done up to this point, the work that continues as we move forward, it has to be institutionalized. It has to be moved forward in a very intentional way. And I think your work will help us move that forward. And again, it's not just about planning, it's really about everything that we do. And you spoke a lot about some of the challenges and issues. I will say a lot of this has to do with trust. And we have work to do to build trust. That's not a planning issue, that's a public sector issue with the communities that we serve. That's an institutional issue that we have to do better. And that is a process. You don't build trust in a moment. You build trust by slowly thawing some of the distrust to a point where you rebuild it to where it needs to be. So, we talked a lot in this, and the report that you have presented us talks a lot about reactions, and I think that's really important, but we also, as we do this work, have to go deeper into why those reactions were there. What is at the core of that distrust that makes someone feel that when you say this, what it means to me is that, right, which are two different things. And we have to do a better job of really thinking through that. Are you concerned about what we're talking about here, or is there something deeper in that conversation? I think that speaks to a lot of what colleagues have mentioned here, and I think it speaks to what you had mentioned. I will note, I think it's very interesting. We talk about differences, but both white respondents and BIPOC respondents noted environmental sustainability and a strong economy and jobs as top priorities. So I think that's really important. There are a lot of similarities of what people care about, what they want for their families, what they want for each other. They just are in different places at certain points, have different perspective, different lived experiences. And I think that's really critical. I think adding those two chapters is going to be important to speak to those concerns. So I'm glad we are moving some of this forward. And I am pleased that we have a schedule to take this up. I do think that doing nothing is not an option. As was said before, we have to move forward. We have to continue to do better. We have to push ourselves and make sure that we don't allow where we know we are coming up short to allow us to shirk our responsibility from doing anything, because we have work to do. And I do think that we have continuous improvements that we need to make. And the key is that we institutionalize the changes that we talk about here and that we build from them. I would guarantee that even in the DC example with Mayor Williams, a great regional leader, that if you did some of the same focus groups and the same conversations in DC, you get a lot of the same answers. And we do have to have a lot of these conversations about chronic disinvestment and displacement, and make sure that we are talking about what those means, because some of the challenges in Montgomery County aren't just necessarily about displacement, they're about chronic disinvestment and what has happened to parts of our county when we've fundamentally ignored them for long periods of time. And so the work continues, the work remains. Your work is really critical to that effort. I really appreciate that and look forward to us taking up these issues, working our way through it, and continuously moving forward on what needs to be an evolving process, but that is repeated, because there's no such thing as culture without repeated action. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Spot on comments, everyone. So we will follow up. We will have that broader context, and we will work aggressively to meet the timeline that has been set forth that we've all agreed to as well. A lot of work to do, but this is obviously a critical document. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.